The candles had barely been lit when Margaret Whitfield gripped her youngest daughter's wrist under the table and whispered a warning that made Alina's stomach turn cold. "Not one word tonight. Do you understand me?" Alina nodded, though her heart was already pounding, because she knew what this dinner meant. The Duke of Ashbourne, the richest and most talked-about man in the county, sat only a few chairs away, and every family in the room had spent weeks preparing for this single evening. Alina's older sisters, Charlotte and Beatrice, had rehearsed their laughter, their compliments, even the tilt of their heads, all designed to catch his attention. Alina had been given no such lines. She had been given only silence. She sat at the far end of the long table, half hidden behind a tall silver candelabra, watching her sisters perform for a man who barely seemed to notice them. The Duke answered their questions politely, but his eyes kept drifting away, scanning the room as though searching for something the conversation could not give him. Alina kept her gaze fixed on her plate, exactly as she had been taught since childhood. Speak only when spoken to. Better yet, do not speak at all. Let your sisters shine. It had been the rule of her life for as long as she could remember, and tonight, with the family's future balanced on this one dinner, the rule felt heavier than ever. Then, without warning, she felt it. A pull, like invisible thread tightening across the table. She looked up and found the Duke's eyes already on her. Not glancing, watching. For a moment neither of them moved, and the noise of the room seemed to fade into the background. Alina's breath caught in her throat. She quickly lowered her eyes, terrified that even this small, accidental moment might be seen as improper, might be the very thing that ruined everything her mother had worked so hard to arrange. But the damage, if it could be called that, was already done. The Duke's attention had shifted, and it did not return to her sisters for the rest of the evening. He answered their questions with shorter and shorter replies, his mind clearly elsewhere. Margaret noticed it too, and her jaw tightened with quiet fury directed at no one in particular, though Alina could feel the blame settling on her shoulders like a stone. When the dinner finally ended and the guests began to rise, the Duke lingered near the doorway a moment longer than politeness required. His eyes found Alina once more across the crowded room, and this time there was something unmistakable in his expression, a flicker of curiosity that no one else seemed to notice. Alina forced herself to look away, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her shawl. She told herself it meant nothing, a passing glance, nothing more. Yet as her family's carriage pulled away into the dark countryside, she could not stop replaying that single locked gaze, wondering why a man who could have anyone in the room had chosen, even for one heartbeat, to look at the daughter who had been told never to be seen. The invitation arrived 3 days later, and it changed everything Alina thought she understood about her place in the world. Lord Ashbourne was hosting a garden gathering at his estate, and every family with an unmarried daughter had been asked to attend. Margaret nearly wept with joy when the card arrived, already planning which gown Charlotte would wear, which topics Beatrice would raise in conversation. Alina, as always, was told only one thing: stay near the roses, stay quiet, let your sisters lead. The Whitfield family arrived at the estate to find the gardens transformed into something out of a painting, with white tables scattered beneath blooming trees and soft music drifting from a string quartet near the fountain. Alina walked a careful distance behind her mother and sisters, her eyes lowered, her hands folded, playing the role she had played her entire life. She watched other young women compete for the Duke's attention with practiced smiles and clever remarks, and she felt, not for the first time, invisible in the truest sense of the word. The Duke moved through the gathering with polite patience, nodding at compliments, answering questions about his estate and his travels. Alina's sisters took their turn, offering flattering opinions about a recent political matter he had mentioned, agreeing with whatever he said before he had even finished his sentence. He listened, but his expression remained distant, almost tired, as though he had heard the same empty agreement 100 times before. Then, as the group paused near a stone bench, the Duke turned his head and looked directly at Alina, who stood slightly apart from the others near a row of white roses. "What do you think, Miss Whitfield?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying easily across the quiet garden. Every conversation around them stopped. Alina felt her mother's eyes snap toward her, sharp and warning, but there was no way to disappear now. All eyes had turned to her, waiting. Her mind raced. She could give a safe answer, something vague and pleasant that matched whatever her sisters had already said. It would be the easy path, the expected path. But something inside her, some quiet strength she had buried for years, refused to let the moment pass that way. She lifted her chin slightly and spoke, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, offering an honest answer that disagreed, gently but clearly, with the opinion her sisters had just given. A ripple of surprise moved through the small crowd. Margaret's face went pale. Charlotte's smile faltered. But the Duke's expression changed in a way no one expected. His tired politeness vanished, replaced by genuine interest, his eyes brightening as though someone had finally said something worth hearing. He asked a follow-up question, leaning slightly forward, clearly wanting to hear more of what she thought rather than less. Alina answered again, carefully but honestly, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt truly seen rather than merely present. The conversation between them stretched on for several minutes, the rest of the garden fading into the background, until someone finally interrupted with a comment about refreshments. The Duke thanked Alina with a small, sincere bow before turning back to the group, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than necessary. As the family gathered their things to leave, Margaret pulled Alina aside, her voice a tight whisper filled with both anger and confusion. "What have you done?" she asked, though neither of them yet understood the full answer. The carriage ride home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than Alina was used to. Her mother stared out the window, arms crossed, while Charlotte and Beatrice exchanged nervous glances. Alina sat quietly in the corner, replaying every word she had spoken, wondering if she had ruined everything her family had worked toward or, for the first time in her life, done something right. That evening, after the household had gone still, Margaret summoned Alina to the drawing room. Her mother's voice was low but sharp, reminding Alina of every rule she had broken, every risk she had created for the family's future. "You embarrassed your sisters," Margaret said, packing near the fireplace. "You were told to stay quiet, and instead you argued with a duke in front of half the county." Alina tried to explain that he had asked her directly, that ignoring him would have seemed strange, but her mother refused to listen, insisting that a proper young woman always finds a way to agree. For the next several days, the tension in the house did not fade. Charlotte barely spoke to Alina at meals, and Beatrice made pointed comments about girls who forgot their place. Alina bore it quietly, retreating to her room each evening, staring out at the dark fields beyond the window, wondering if speaking her mind had truly been a mistake. Yet beneath the guilt, something new had settled inside her, a small flicker of pride she could not fully extinguish, no matter how hard her family tried to smother it. Then, on the fifth morning, a messenger arrived at the Whitfield home carrying a parcel addressed not to the family, but specifically to Miss Alina Whitfield. The household fell into stunned silence as the housekeeper carried it in. Inside was a book, carefully chosen, on the very subject Alina had spoken about in the garden, along with a short, polite note from the Duke himself, thanking her for an honest and thoughtful conversation he said he rarely had the pleasure of enjoying. Margaret's hands trembled as she read the note over Alina's shoulder, her anger slowly shifting into something closer to disbelief. This was not a gesture aimed at the family as a whole. It was aimed at Alina alone, and everyone in the room understood exactly what that meant. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away, while Beatrice stared at the book as though it had personally wronged her. That night, alone in her room, Alina held the note in her hands and read it again and again. For years she had been taught that her opinions were dangerous, that her voice was something to be hidden away for the sake of others. Yet here was proof, small but undeniable, that the very thing she had been silenced for was the thing that had made someone truly notice her. She did not yet know where this path would lead, but for the first time, She allowed herself to imagine a future where her voice was not a mistake to apologize for, but a gift worth sharing. The tension in the Whitfield household grew heavier with each passing week, but it was the county ball, held at Lord Ashbourne's estate, that finally forced everything into the open. The great hall shimmered with candlelight and music, filled with families eager to secure the Duke's attention before the season ended. Margaret had instructed Alina once again to remain silent, to smile politely and disappear into the background while Charlotte took the lead. Alina agreed outwardly, though something inside her had already begun to change. Midway through the evening, a cruel rumor began spreading through the crowd, whispered from one guest to another with obvious delight. Someone claimed that the Whitfield family had fallen deeply into debt and was using Charlotte and Beatrice as bait to trap the Duke into marriage for money alone. The accusation was sharp and humiliating, and within minutes, Margaret's face had gone white with panic, unable to find the right words to defend her family without confirming the very rumor she wished to deny. Charlotte froze, her carefully practiced charm collapsing under the weight of public embarrassment, while Beatrice looked close to tears. The Duke, standing nearby, watched the scene unfold with a troubled expression, clearly uncertain whether to intervene in what appeared to be a private family matter. It was Alina, the daughter always told to remain silent, who stepped forward without hesitation. In a clear and steady voice, she addressed the small crowd gathered nearby, calmly explaining the truth behind her family's situation, correcting the exaggerated rumor with simple, honest facts rather than emotional denial. She spoke of her father's hard work, the family's genuine hardships, and the unfair nature of turning private struggles into public gossip for entertainment. Her words carried a quiet strength that silenced the whispers far more effectively than anger or tears ever could have. The Duke stepped closer, visibly impressed by her composure, and added his own firm words, stating plainly that he had found nothing but honesty and integrity in his conversations with the Whitfield family. His support, given openly before the entire hall, ended the rumor almost instantly, the gossiping guests quickly finding something else to discuss. Margaret stood frozen, staring at her youngest daughter with an expression that mixed disbelief and something close to gratitude. Charlotte, still shaken, offered Alina a small, genuine nod of thanks, the first real acknowledgement she had given her in years. The Duke lingered nearby as the crowd slowly returned to their conversations, his gaze fixed on Alina with unmistakable admiration. Later that evening, as the music continued and the tension in the hall finally eased, the Duke approached Alina directly, away from the crowd. He spoke plainly, telling her that her courage tonight had confirmed everything he had already begun to feel since their first conversation in the garden. Alina listened, her heart racing, hardly able to believe that the very voice her family had spent years trying to silence was now being praised by the one man whose opinion could change her entire future. The morning after the ball, the Whitfield household was unusually quiet, though this silence carried none of the fear it once had. Margaret sat alone in the drawing room for a long while before finally calling Alina to her side. When Alina entered, expecting another scolding, she found her mother's eyes soft with an emotion she rarely showed. Margaret admitted, quietly and with some difficulty, that she had been wrong to silence her for so many years, that watching Alina defend the family with honesty had shown her a strength she had never allowed her daughter the chance to use. Charlotte, though still adjusting to the shift in attention, offered Alina an unexpected kindness over the following days, asking her opinion on small matters where before she would have dismissed her entirely. Beatrice remained a little cooler, unwilling to fully let go of old jealousies, but even she could not deny the respect Alina had earned that night. The family, cracked and imperfect as it was, slowly began to make room for the daughter it had once tried to keep invisible. Word of the Duke's growing attachment to Alina spread quickly through the county, and within weeks, he requested a private meeting with her father to discuss his intentions properly. Alina sat nearby during parts of the conversation, no longer hidden away in another room as tradition might have demanded, but present included, her thoughts asked for rather than ignored. The Duke spoke honestly of his admiration, explaining that it was not her beauty or her family's name that had drawn him, but the simple fact that she had never once told him what she thought he wanted to hear. Their courtship that followed was quiet and steady, built on long conversations rather than empty flattery. Alina found herself speaking freely for the first time in her life, sharing thoughts on books, on the estate, on matters she once believed were forbidden to her. The Duke listened with genuine interest every time, never once asking her to soften her opinions or hide her intelligence for the sake of appearances. On the day of their wedding, Alina stood at the front of the chapel, surrounded by a family that had finally learned to value her voice instead of silencing it. Margaret watched with tearful pride, Charlotte smiled without a trace of old resentment, and even Beatrice offered a genuine, if quiet, blessing. As Alina took the Duke's hand, she thought back to that first dinner, to the whispered warning to stay silent, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude for the courage that had carried her past it. Years later, as Duchess of Ashbourne, Alina became known throughout the county not for her silence, but for her wisdom, her honesty, and her willingness to speak plainly on matters others avoided. She often thought of the girl she had once been, hidden behind candelabras and warnings, and smiled at how far her own voice had carried her. The very thing she had been taught to fear had become the foundation of a life built on respect, understanding, and a love that never once asked her to disappear.